Okay, so in the last video I ended up by telling you that what you want to look for are clinical trials. You don't want to rely on correlational studies to make your decisions. So I think I need to explain to you why clinical trials are better and why they're really the only ones that you should rely on. So to do that, we need to talk about a concept which is causation and correlation and what they mean and what the difference is. Okay, so causation. Causation means that there is a factor, which we're going to call X, and that it influences some sort of natural process, and when it interacts with that natural process, it causes an outcome, which we're going to call Y. So X, we say X causes Y to happen. Okay, in correlation, what happens is you have an individual and there are two factors associated with that individual thing. And so the observation is that they occur simultaneously. When you see a correlation, it is really tempting to assume that those two things are there at the same time because X caused Y. And sometimes that's true, because if X does cause Y, then X and Y will be there at the same time for that point. But the problem is that X and Y can end up being associated with the same thing at the same time by coincidence or for other reasons. And so while if X causes Y, X and Y will be correlated. If X and Y are correlated, X is not necessarily causing Y. Okay, so it goes in one direction but not the other. So what we are interested in is science. In science is causation. That's what we want to show. We want to show that if you take, say, vitamin E, we want to know, does that give you cancer or does that protect you from cancer? Okay. So I want to show you some examples of what I mean about an individual having two things associated with it. So here's a graph, and what was graphed on the x-axis was the number of lemons, actually in metric tons of lemons, that came into the United States from Mexico in a given year. And on the y-axis was the total U.S. highway fatality rate for that year. So for 1996, there was so many lemons imported, and there was a certain U.S. highway fatality rate. Well, lo and behold, if you put those points on a graph, you will see that the more fresh lemons were imported that came into the United States, the lower the fatality rate. Okay? Those two things are associated with the same year. Now, when we see a graph like this, we're trained to say cause and effect because it looks like increasing this causes this. And that's what the results of an experiment look like. But this was not an experiment. Okay? These things happened naturally, and they just happened to occur at the same point in time during a year. And there was a trend. There were lots of things going on. Maybe what happened is in 1996 there was some sort of trade agreement which had a gradual phase-in period, and at the same time there was a traffic rule that had the same phase-in. So it could have been totally unrelated, and yet there's the data. So that's a correlation. Now, so an example of a correlation that has nutritional applications and that is not silly is this. And this is the original data. It comes from 1985 that caused people to begin to think that maybe vitamin E protects people against prostate cancer. So what they did is they took a bunch of people. This was a large sample. I think this was in Finland. It was a large group of people. And they asked a whole bunch of people, you know, what they ate in one day. And from that, they assumed that the amount of vitamin E that was in that day's diet was typical of what they ate every day. Okay. So they collected this information about their diet, and then they waited 10 years and asked the people to come back and just check in with them and do a physical. And then if people did come back, they checked the death records to see if maybe they died, and if so, what did they die of. So of that population that they collected this vitamin E data from, the people who had cancer at some point during that period had lower levels of vitamin E at their diet at the beginning of the study than the people who did. Okay, so if vitamin E is protecting you against cancer, then you would expect, if it caused it, then you would expect those things to be correlated. But the fact that they were correlated doesn't actually prove the causation. And so just to convince you of that, for example, what if the reason that the vitamin E was lower in the diet is because foods that have vitamin E are more expensive, and the people who had more vitamin E in their diet, right, these guys, because they were wealthier, they went to the doctor more often, and they were able to do other preventative stuff. Maybe they exercised, all sorts of things. So in this example that I was giving you, there's an underlying cause that's independent that both causes high vitamin level E and low cancer rates, but that common cause, these two effects of the same cause, don't cause each other. Okay. So what I wanted to remind you of is this thing called the scientific method. I know you guys have seen this many times. One way to think about correlational studies is because they can sometimes be the consequence of a cause and effect relationship, they are observational studies. You see them and you go, maybe there's something going on here. Sometimes when these studies happen, when you do the experiments, and the experiments are clinical trials, animal studies, and cell studies, when you do these experiments, it will turn out that the correlation was due to a true cause and effect relationship. But sometimes it will turn out that it's due to another factor. So epidemiological studies and case control studies, they give hints about what might be found, and they set off whole new lines of research, and that's why the media loves to report on them, is because they're so tantalizing. They have hints of something that you never knew before. This is the first wave. But in order to actually prove it, what you have to do is you have to start with a hypothesis. In my example, vitamin E prevents prostate cancer. And then you have to do an experiment that has a given, that you can predict a certain result, and then you do the experiment and compare the result. And if the results don't support the hypothesis, then you reject it. Okay. So let's talk about what an experiment would look like and how that would be different than the correlation. Okay, experiments working with human subjects are called clinical trials. And what you do is you start with a group of people, all right, all of whom are the same. So in that correlational study, they all started with a group of people. But instead of asking them what they ate, you go in and you randomly assign them to two different groups. One is the treatment and one is the control. You control who eats the high vitamin E and who eats the low vitamin D. You don't allow pre-existing factors and that you don't know about to be the one that controls that choice. Okay, so the experimenter controls the subjects. So once you've randomly assigned them to it, then you would give the vitamin E pills to the treatment group, and then to the control group you give them a placebo. Okay, it's important that the placebo look like the treatment, because there is this thing called the placebo effect, where if the control group knows that they're getting the placebo, they won't follow through. They don't report back. Maybe they don't take the pills because they think, what's the problem? So that it can influence the outcome. Also, if people know that they're getting the placebo, and if they have any control over it, like asking them how they feel about something, they will bias the results. So if they know they're not supposed to feel anything from it, then if they do feel something, they'll say, well, it must just not be important, and they won't report it. So it's important that the subject and the control and the treatment groups not know which one they're getting. Now, of course, this thing about having it be double-blind, it's not important in animal studies where the animals can't, like, they don't have the mental ability to try and bias the results. Okay, but for humans, that's important. So then the other thing is that the patients can't know, not only the patients can't know what type of pill they're getting, which is single blind, but the physician can't know. Because if the physician knows, then they can do the same thing. They will, just instead of reporting what they see, they will report what they think they should see. And it can be pretty subtle. So if neither the physician or the people who are assigning the drugs know, nor the patient knows, that's called a double-blind study. Okay, so then after you administer the treatments, then you wait for whatever time is appropriate for the health effect to happen that you think is going to happen. For cancer, it's 10, 15, 20 years, which is why it takes forever to do these studies. And then at the end, you compare how many have cancer in the two treatment groups. Of course, if what you want to do is, your hypothesis is that vitamin E prevents cancer, then you would expect the cancer rates to be lower in the ones that got vitamin E than in the ones that got the placebo. Okay. So here is two examples of studies, both all done on vitamin E. This is the one that I think this is the 1985, no, this is 1997. This is a later one. And this is an example of a correlational study. Okay. Why? And right here you can see it says epidemiologic. So here there's a bunch of clues in here. One is it says relation. All right. Relation is another way to say correlation. And then if you read, what they did is they just made observations. All right. And they will also say things like risk factor, etc. Okay, so an epidemiological study is a correlational study. Here, this one, it says right up front, it's a matched case control. Now, this is one of the reasons why we went to the trouble to teach you the vocabulary of epidemiological studies, case control studies, etc., is if you know the lingo, you can look at a study and quickly tell what type of it is. But then down here, when you read the description, they'll say it again. Case control pairs came from a random sample, and all of the pairing and comparison and splitting them into groups came at the end. All right, they didn't actually do anything to these people. So both of these are correlational studies. Okay, this is the clinical trial. So here, once again, they're going to tell you if they do a randomized controlled trial, this is a very expensive study to do, very difficult, very long, and they're going to brag about it. They're going to advertise it. So right there it says it's a randomized controlled trial. Under publication type, it will say clinical trial right there. So those are all hints that this is a clinical trial. And once again, using this subject type, publication type, you can type in clinical trial and just restrict it to that. So what I want you to do next is go back to that results list, that Medline results list, and now don't look just for any old primary article, but find the results of a clinical trial. Okay. So after you've done that, then I'm going to have you use that clinical trial for one more video.